study for this week, prepping. Hope I can do as good of a job as is shown in Scripture. It's an amazing passage. It's very thrilling. It's continuing our messages on Genesis. And we're going to cover some things as we go through this passage of how God did what he did. Now, when you talk about the flood of Noah's day, let me just say this. In the accounts of even some evangelical scholars, there are many who say, oh, well, this is just a myth. Or, besides calling it a myth, some of them will say it's just a local flood, and it was a flood for Noah, and he put some animals there, I don't know how you can read this and get that. And I remember even as a teenager, hearing stuff and going, either it's true or it isn't, and if you start saying that's not true, Genesis, then you got a real problem with the whole rest of the Bible. So we want to talk about this as we go on. In Genesis chapter 7, I have several points that we're going to make this morning, actually 4. And the first one is what I call the final preparation. The final preparation for the deluge. The second one is the miraculous migration. Most people just kind of read over it. They don't understand it. This is an amazing miracle that happened when the animals came to Noah. And thirdly, the facts of fitting all those creatures into the ark. We'll talk about that. That's a big problem with a lot of skeptics. And then finally, for today, the historical day of the deluge as we go into it. So let's look into the scriptures, chapter 7, verse 1. And when you're reading, just think, does this read like somebody just made up a story? Or does this read like an actual account given by somebody who was there? So Genesis chapter 7, verse 1. When everything was ready, the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the boat with all your family. For among all the people of the earth, I can see that you alone are righteous." And as you know from previous sermons on this book, Genesis, we're talking perhaps billions of people who were alive at that time. Noah alone was found righteous. Verse 2, "Take with you 7 pairs, male and female, of each animal that I have approved for eating and for sacrifice. And take 1 pair of each of the others. Also, take 7 pairs of every kind of bird. There must be a male and a female in each pair to ensure that all life will survive on earth after the flood." Now, there are several points that we can observe from this initial preparation passage. We have to remember Noah and his sons have been working on the ark and warning the pre-flood population of the coming deluge for 100 years, at least. We already know of the concept of clean and unclean from the time of Cain and Abel and their sacrifices. God has designated certain animals as clean. And the reason is very simple, and yet it's very profound. Right? They are clean because God says they're clean. Right? There's no special biological reason. I mean, it's true that many of the animals they called clean were less likely to have disease, but that wasn't why. It was because God declared them clean. It was a teaching point here. A lot of the Bible a lot of the points in the Bible are teaching points. And so they're clean because God says they're clean. He imparts his righteousness, just as Noah is righteous and found grace in the eyes of the Lord because he said he did. It's given to him by the Lord. Later, when Peter has his vision, what does the Lord say to Peter? When Peter is shown these unclean animals, and he's told to take and eat, and Peter says, "But Lord, I've never eaten anything that's unclean," or something like that. Well, the Lord sets Peter straight. He says, "Do not declare unclean what I have declared clean." Right? So it's not the type of the animal, or the fact that some animals have more diseases, although those things may be true. It's a providential decision of Almighty God. Now, I found this very interesting. Historians have found that other people groups, and they all came from who? They all came from Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? So it's not that long ago, folks. Not that long ago that our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, whatever, go back, was Noah. And it's the same for every person on this earth. So they found that other people groups have tended to call the lambs and the cattle, and even in some cases the goats, as clean, and they would sacrifice those types of animals. Now, interestingly enough, they would only sacrifice dogs when they were sacrificing them to demons or to take away some evil sickness, whatever. So, evidently some of that teaching went down from the generations, just as the flood accounts went down to over 500 people groups. It's actually probably more than that. The more we find out as men have explored the earth and found the different people groups, they found out more flood accounts. So taking extra pairs of clean animals was very simple. There's a simple reason for it, right? Because they do sacrifices. And if you don't have extra clean animals, what's going to happen? Well, we just sacrificed and wiped out that species. Whoops. No, God's not going to let that happen. So they were there to preserve the species. And so God is preserving. Now, believe it or not, there are actually many scholars who push this idea of a mythical flood or a local flood. But the end of verse 3 ought to dispel that idea from their minds. It says at the end of verse 3, there must be a male and a female in each pair to ensure what? That all life will survive on the earth after the flood. All life will survive. Now, that would be some local flood that causes the extinction of all life, right? So there's nothing about the historical, factual way this passage is written to indicate that this was anything other than what it said it is. And that is a global, catastrophic, mountain-topping flood that wiped out all living creatures on earth, above ground, except those in the ark. And I mentioned before, early scholars like Plato and Aristotle, they spoke of the flood as a generally accepted fact. Everything fits, right? It's like a hand in a glove if you look at it. And the way things panned out, we'll go through some of it this morning. But everything fits like a hand in a glove, a very large glove, right? A very large one. But it fits. You don't have to twist stuff. I remember thinking to myself several years ago, right? Several years after coming to faith in Christ, and being exposed to a few years of skepticism by my science teachers and books in high school. And I remember thinking, either the Bible's true or it isn't. I need to know. So I began asking questions and studying. And my preacher was smart enough to send me to the radical Christian neighbor, right, who came to know the Lord through the ministry of that church. He studied more than a month, right? And he was constantly studying, constantly reaching out to other people. He had been saved out of a very, very rough life. And in fact, when he got saved, people were like, What? Karen got saved? You gotta be kidding me. Right? This is a hard-drinking, hard-living, foul-mouthed guy who is just, and he had an amazing story himself as far as his life goes, but, and it's interesting that the preacher sent me to him. You know what? I think he knew that Gary would have the right answers. I think he knew that. And so Gary introduced me to these two scientists, well, their books, not to them personally, Dr. Henry Morris and Dr. Dwayne Gish. And he showed me some heavy-duty science books that they had written. One of them was the Genesis flood, about 600 pages. And no, I did not read it right then. I did read it later on. It took me about a year and a half to go through that. It was really, really heavy-duty stuff. But it was enough to know that there were answers. And later, at Liberty, I studied more on my own with the help of Dr. Lane Lester, my advisor. And I was stunned at the huge amount of evidence for what we believe. Right? I was also a bit upset that I had never been exposed to both sides, because there's scientific evidence on our side, but the preponderance of evidence is on the biblical side. And I asked myself, Why would the public schools only share one side of the evidence? Or are they hiding something? Most propagandists are. So more study showed they were hiding the truth. So we're going to continue in the truth, because what did Jesus say? He said, the truth will set you free, right? So we move on from the preparation, and there was much more we could go into, a whole sermon itself, but we move on to the miraculous migration, verse 4. 7 days from now, I will make the rains pour down on the earth, it says, and it will rain for 40 days and 40 nights until I have wiped from the earth all the living things I have created. So Noah did everything as the Lord commanded him. You'll read that a lot about Noah. A very wise decision on his part. That's why he lived, right? Noah was 600 years old when the flood covered the earth. He went on board the boat to escape the flood, he and his wife and his sons and their wives. And with them were all the various kinds of animals, those approved for eating and for sacrifice, and those that were not, along with all the birds and small animals that scurry along the ground. They entered the boats in pairs, male and female, just as God had commanded Noah. Now you notice that it didn't say Noah was pushing them along or ushering them. It just says they entered. We'll talk about that in a second. If you haven't noticed a pattern by now, you should. And that is that the Bible often mentions very general overviews of what happened, with the specifics that are supplied shortly thereafter. What skeptics like to do is they pull the general overview out of context to mock the Bible. Now, Noah didn't run around chasing the animals. God sent the animals to him, as he did in the first chapters of Genesis, when Adam what? What did Adam do in the first couple of Genesis chapters? He named them, right? Pretty prodigious memory he had. Wish I had that kind of memory. What? The same God who created the animals out of the dust can't make them migrate to Noah? Of course he can. Some would say this explains two things the animals do that we don't really have an explanation for. One is migration and the other is hibernation. Maybe. I mean, the Bible doesn't say, so we just have to, we can guess though. It's fun. We know for sure the animals came to Noah and they voluntarily got on the ark. 40 days and 40 nights of rain, that's often mocked. Because, you know, today, if all the moisture in the atmosphere came down, guess how much rain we'd get all over the earth? A half an inch to an inch. That's all there is in the atmosphere now. But things were very, very different then, right? The pre-flood earth, the Bible said, had waters above and waters below. Some have called it a canopy, a hydrosphere under the earth, a canopy above. We don't know exactly how it was. Scientifically, a lot of scientists have done some calculations, and to be frank with you, they're confused, and it's confusing. But we know there was water above and there was water below. And that whole system is about to be destroyed. And Noah and his family are commanded to get on board, right? Listen, here's what it says, verse 5. So Noah did everything the Lord commanded him. He was 600 years old when the flood covered the earth. He went on board the boat to escape the flood. He and his wife and his sons and their wife. By the way, 600 years. Last time I checked, in reading obituaries, I like to read them. It's kind of a little hobby I have, to see if my name's in there. And it's not so far. But none of them lived to be 600. None of them lived to be 200. In fact, if you see 110 or 115, that's unusual, right? Well, back then, people did live long ages, and the Bible gives the account of those before the flood. After the flood, rapidly it went down for a lot of different reasons. One, God said it was going to. But we believe that that canopy above prevented the UV light from coming in and causing a lot of problems that it causes today. And the Babylonians and other cultures also talked about people living to be 1,000 years old. So it's there. With them, it says, it goes on, they went on board the ark to escape the flood. He and his wife and his sons and their wives. With them were all the various kinds of animals. Those approved for animal, for sacrifice, for eating, for sacrifice, and those that were not. Along with all the birds and the small animals that scurry along the ground. They entered the boats in pairs, male and female, just as God had commanded Noah. Well, now this brings up an interesting question that is often presented in a caricature fashion. I once wrote a series of articles in the Press Republican when I lived in Plattsburgh and ministered there, and they were on creation, and I had the privilege of debating the head of anthropology at Plattsburgh State, and that resulted in an article being written and things like that. So one of the writers for the Press Republican wrote an article and said, well, the insects alone would have swamped the ark. And that's not true at all. The fact that all of the creatures described went into the ark is the source of that ridicule. But there are scientists who laid out exactly how this was done. The ark was not a little boat. It was a rescue barge, so to speak. And it would have held well over 125,000 sheep-sized animals. The average animal would be smaller than a sheep, much smaller. But it would have easily held over 125,000. It had 1.5 to 2.5 million cubic feet of space, or over 600 railroad boxcars. So Noah didn't need to bring a pair, for example, of all the different types of dogs that we have today. Right? He didn't need to bring them all. There's like, I don't know, 500 kinds of different types of dogs that we know today. And if you include wolves and foxes and things like that, he didn't need to do that. In fact, he just needed to bring one pair of dog kind into the ark. One pair of, for example, cats. Or 7 pairs of cows, cattle, whatever. And the genetic mix would come from them. And it's interestingly that genetically we can trace back, numbers we can trace back, and it goes like it's an upside down pyramid with a broad side up today. It goes down to a very small number way too quickly for millions or billions of years. We're talking thousands. It goes down very rapidly, right? And so it shows that indeed something did happen not that long ago. So go back in time, the numbers and diversity go back down. Even dogs, for example, 2,000 years ago, there were not nearly as many types of dogs as there are today. And it goes down like an upside down pyramid. So again, insects, same thing. It goes back down. We didn't have to bring all the different types of, for example, squirrels. They just was two squirrels, right? Genetics and DNA are amazing. Trillions of times better at storing information than any computer chip. And scientists are stunned. I remember reading an article, they were stunned at how quickly humans even diversify. You put a group of humans down in Africa, and very quickly you're going to find out something, right? You put a group of humans up in Alaska, and very quickly you're going to find out something, right? And same thing with animals. They're going to diversify very, very quickly to adapt to the places where they're at. People in Africa who had the darker shades of skin did way better than those that didn't. Up north is a whole different story. And so I remember reading this and wow, we're surprised. We thought this would take a really, really long time. It didn't. It just took several generations and that was it, right? And so if you think about it, Acts chapter 17, verse 24, beginning there, it kind of gives a good explanation. God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life and breath and all things. And this is the key verse. And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. So, they all came from one blood, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and we move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, shaped by art and man's devising. Truly, these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to to all by raising him from the dead. All right? And so, genetically, it goes down. In fact, I remember reading in scientific journals about mitochondrial Adam and mitochondrial Eve. And they said, yep, 100,000 years ago, we can trace it back down to 2 people. And then a little bit later, they found out that the mitochondrial process actually happened a lot faster than they thought. And if you did the math, which they weren't very interested in doing, it came out to be like 4,000 or 5,000 years. Of course, the scientists who are creationists picked up right away that, and then you didn't hear any more about that. So they did come from just 2. So the historical day of the deluge is our next and final point for today. The historical day of the deluge is written like a historical book would write, right? You think about it, the great events that have happened, when a big, huge storm or something comes, and we read about it historically, we're given dates and times and things like that when they happen. 9/11, those who are old enough to remember, 9/11 stands for 9/11, right? 2001, when we were attacked. We remember the date, the time, and where we were, what we were doing. Don't you think the flood isn't any different? And here's what it says in the Bible. This does not sound like somebody just made up a story. Verse 10. After 7 days, the waters of the flood came and covered the earth. When Noah was 600 years old, on the 17th day of the 2nd month. Now, don't go trying to figure that was in February, because it was a totally different calendar, totally different system. But it gives a date, right, when it happened. The 2nd month, the 17th day. If it was today, it would be February 17th. All the underground waters erupted from the earth, and the rain fell in mighty torrents from the sky. The rain continued to fall for 40 days and 40 nights. That very day, Noah had gone into the boat with his wife and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. With them in the boat were pairs of every kind of animal, domestic and wild, large and small, along with the birds of every kind. 2 by 2 they came into the boat, representing every living thing that breathes. A male and female of each kind entered, just as God had commanded Noah. Then the Lord closed the door behind them. For 40 days the floodwaters grew deeper, covering the ground and lifting the boat high above the earth. As the waters rose higher and higher above the ground, the boat floated safely on the surface. Finally, the water covered even the highest mountains on the earth, rising more than 22 feet above the highest peaks. All the living things on earth died. Birds, domestic animals, wild animals, small animals that scurry along the ground, and all the people. Everything that breathed and lived on the dry land died. Gee, that sounds like a local flood, doesn't it? No. That sounds like a global, worldwide, mountain-topping flood. God wiped out every living thing on the earth, people, livestock, small animals that scurry on the ground, and the birds of the sky. All were destroyed. The only people who survived were Noah and those with him in the boat. And the flood waters covered the earth for 150 days. So it's clear, as mentioned before, that in the pre-flood earth, not only was the geography different, the hydrological cycle was different too. The Bible describes the waters below and the waters above, right? The water would kind of percolate up like little springs would water the earth. And they didn't have rain then. It just kind of percolated up. They had some kind of a hydro canopy over them, and they're very, very different. And all of this was then used to flood the earth. The Bible describes the waters above and the waters below, and it all collapsed. And that below exploded up. So the ark saved them in many ways. Volcanoes are going off, superheated waters exploding up and out, rivers of water are coming down. As MacArthur says this, he said, the word for rain, as I mentioned last time in our conclusion, is in the Hebrew matar. It means a normal rain, right? Normal rain like perhaps it's falling now. It doesn't mean a torrential downpour, as the normal word would be, but if you have it for 40 days and 40 nights, then it becomes something far greater than normal rain. And that's why in verse 12 it says, and the rain, and it uses a completely different word, geshem, meaning a torrential downpour, right? A torrential downpour, as if a canopy is collapsing, right? Now it's interesting, the fountains of the great deep, it says burst forth. It's a word that means like exploded forth, right? We know that when a volcano goes off, 80% of what comes out is water. Did you know that? Water and a whole lot of pollution, right? More than all of human history combined came out of Krakatoa. So when a volcano explodes, remember reading Mount St. Helens exploded 50,000 feet into the atmosphere? Now multiply that times thousands of volcanoes going off all at the same time. Huge explosions. And so I found it interesting that in 1995, Dr. Louis Frank discovered car and bus-sized frozen chunks of water vapor that come in from outer space. They're called cometesimals. And they impact our atmosphere and they just vaporize and add to our hydrological cycle. Hundreds of millions of tons of water every year. He was ridiculed and mocked. Just the scientist reporting the data, right? And then another scientist said, I checked the data, I repeated it, it's true. It happens. So now we have this. You know what comets are? Comets are like the Halley's Comet comes back every so many years, right? And it doesn't hit us, thankfully. But these cometesimals come right back to the Earth, meaning maybe they came from the Earth, right? Interesting. So they may have originated here. So this catastrophe is described as incredible judgment in two facets. Verse 11, the first thing that happened is all the fountains of the great deep burst open. All the fountains burst open. Now, that means fountains of the great deep. Tehom Rabbah is the Hebrew, and it's the springs of the great abyss. Genesis 1 tells us there was water below the earth and water above it. And one day, the specific dates, the real events happened. So the water below the earth is described as being springs in a great cavern. That's what the Hebrew indicates. Fountains in a great deep, the great abyss, the subterranean reservoirs where the water was contained. And from it rose up water, the roots that came out on the surface of the water of the earth. And when this exploded, this interconnected system, the Hebrew word is baka, talking about the interconnected systems, and it's used 51 times in the Old Testament. It means to divide or to burst is a better translation. So that burst forth up from the subterranean level. Now think about this. Here's superheated water coming out. Billions of tons of organic matter as the earth is flooded. What would happen? Well, here's what would happen. Off the coast of California, it gives us a little bit of an idea. Scientists were exploring up there and they found a volcanic vent coming up through all the muck on the bottom of the ocean. And they looked at it, and I have a video clip of this. And here's this muck and this superheated water. What do you mean superheated water? It's like 500 degrees. Well, water boils at 212, but if you put enough pressure on it, it gets a lot hotter. So this 500-degree water is coming up out of the earth. It hits the organic material, and here's these little golden drops. And they said, well, what are those? So they captured some of them. You know what they were? They were crude oil being instantly formed on the bottom of the ocean. So multiply that times thousands of volcanoes, lots of organic material, and you find the origin of our oil deposits all over the earth, right? And if it's wood, it turns into not oil, it turns into coal. And there's our coal deposits formed by the flood all over the earth. Interesting. So there are billions of dead things, including humans, right? I like to say maybe when we gas up, we're, ancestors, right? So anyway, buried in rock and volcanic layers with superheated water all over the earth, resulting in oil or coal or fossils. Now, would God judge sinners? How could a loving God, well, he sure did. In the flood, right, he judged billions of people by the billions. The world that was then perished. What else happened? Under the water, while Noah's floating up there and his family, continents are being ripped apart. I mentioned before, it wasn't continental drift, it was more like continental speedboats. One scientist estimated they were probably going about 40 to 50 miles an hour as the continents ripped apart. It's called catastrophism. Very rarely are scientists right when they talk about how things happened in the past. They're always way too slow, way too long. So these continents are ripped apart. Civilization was utterly destroyed, wiped right off the face of the earth. Right? Even floods that we have today.